Hello guys, welcome to Hidden Timelines. Today we step into the candlelit corridors of the Winter Palace in St. Petersburg, a place where gold reflected not only wealth but also humiliation, intrigue, and the seeds of revolution. It is the year 1762. Imagine a palace so opulent that even Versailles might blush, marble staircases spiralling into endless galleries, mirrors stretching ceilings into illusions of infinity, servants moving silently across parquet floors polished like ice. And within this glittering labyrinth, a young woman of 33 walks with her chin held high, even as her world seems to crumble beneath her feet. Her name, Sophie of Anhalt-Zerbst, known now to Russia as Catherine. The world will one day remember her as Catherine the Great, but in this moment she is neither empress nor saviour, only a wife publicly humiliated by her husband Peter III. Peter had not simply betrayed her in private, he had turned infidelity into spectacle. His mistress Elizabeth Vorontsova was installed within the palace itself, treated with honours that mocked Catherine's title. Worse still, Peter declared openly his intention to divorce Catherine and crown Vorontsova in her place. In the language of court ceremony, that was not just marital insult, it was political annihilation. But here is the paradox, is that history so often teaches humiliation, when endured by someone with patience and vision, can become the crucible of power. Catherine was not the helpless consort Peter imagined. From the moment she had arrived in Russia at the age of 14, foreign German, and unable to speak a word of the language, she had trained herself like a soldier but of the mind. She mastered Russian so fluently that courtiers forgot her origins. She memorized scripture not for piety but to charm the Orthodox clergy. She read Voltaire, Montesquieu and Plutarch by candlelight, all while her husband played with tin soldiers and toyed with Prussia's foreign policy like a reckless child. Peter's mistake was simple and fatal. He assumed Catherine's silence meant submission. He never asked why officers of the guard bowed more deeply to her than to him, or why foreign ambassadors lingered longer in her company than his. He never noticed the web quietly knitting itself behind her calm smile. To understand Catherine's genius, we must first pause and recognize the stage upon which she performed. Russia in the mid-18th century was a country bruised by endless wars, exhausted by the 7 Years' War, its nobility restless, its clergy fiercely protective of privilege, and its army disillusioned with their new Tsar. It was a world waiting for anyone capable of turning discontent into direction. So when Peter flaunted his mistress' mock tradition and spoke of divorce, Catherine did not crumble. She transformed insult into invitation. If Peter could use his position for indulgence, she would use hers for something far more dangerous strategy. And in her hands the tools would not be embroidery needles or polite smiles, but philosophy, seduction, and the careful art of timing. On a June night in 1762, while Peter stumbled drunkenly to bed beside his Vorontsova, Catherine sat awake at her desk, quill scratching across parchment. These were not letters of complaint or pleas for sympathy. They were messages sent to very particular men who commanded regiments, who whispered in foreign courts, who carried the secrets of Russia in their pockets. With every word she sharpened her humiliation into a blade. Because Catherine knew something most of her enemies, and perhaps even most of us, fail to see power does not belong to those who shout loudest or humiliate most brazenly. Power belongs to those who wait, who study, and who strike only when the moment makes the blow appear inevitable. This was the moment Catherine began to turn from consort to conspirator, from victim to architect of empire. What began as Peter's infidelity would soon become the foundation for one of the most dramatic seizures of power in modern European history. And as we follow her story, you'll see how each insult became a stepping stone, how each betrayal became leverage, and how a woman cast aside as ornament became the sharpest strategist of her age. To understand Catherine's rise, we need to leave behind the glitter of the Winter Palace for a moment and return to the long apprenticeship she endured before the coup. Power, after all, is rarely born in a single night. It is layered, studied, rehearsed. Catherine's education was not the sheltered embroidery and courtly music her station prescribed. It was a curriculum of survival crafted by her own hunger to matter in a world that preferred its women ornamental. When she first arrived in Russia at 14, she was a stranger in every possible sense. She was German Lutheran and barely able to pronounce the name of her new homeland. Yet she carried with her an instinct sharper than most seasoned courtiers. To survive, she must adapt faster than anyone expected. And so she set herself the first and most crucial task: fluency. Not just in language, but in the rhythms of Russian politics, the liturgy of the Orthodox Church, the etiquette that governed who sat where, who bowed to whom, and whose hand one dared to kiss. It is tempting to think of etiquette as decoration. Catherine never did. For her, it was the battlefield where loyalties were tested and hierarchies revealed. She memorized every ritual not to please but to measure. Who looked her in the eye, who hesitated before kneeling, who whispered too loudly in corridors. The smallest gestures became intelligence reports. While her husband Peter squandered his evenings in childish military games, parading toy regiments, dressing his favourites in Prussian uniforms, humiliating Russian officers with his obsession for Frederick the Great, Catherine sat awake with books smuggled in by sympathetic tutors and friends. Montesquieu taught her how laws could shape a nation. Voltaire showed her how satire could pierce tyranny sharper than a sword. Plutarch reminded her that empires rise and fall on the character of their rulers. But let's not romanticize this too quickly. Catherine was not reading as a dreamer. She was reading as a soldier sharpening weapons. Each page she turned, she asked herself, how can this be applied here? In France, the Enlightenment meant salons buzzing with ideas. In Russia, those same ideas had to be whispered, coded, hidden beneath orthodoxy. Yet Catherine learned how to bend them into her arsenal. When nobles raged about Peter's incompetence, she could reply with talk of Montesquieu's balance of powers. When clerics grumbled over confiscated estates, she could summon scripture in Russian so fluent they forgot she had once been foreign. Language was not just communication, it was camouflage and eventually persuasion. By the time she was 20, she spoke Russian, with such ease that she could switch dialects depending on her audience, polished courtry, Russian for the aristocracy, softer village cadences when she wanted to charm servants or guards. Every word was an audition for the role she intended to seize. And so while Peter played at being a soldier in Prussian boots, Catherine rehearsed the part of a ruler and empress, fluent not just in grammar and scripture but in the hidden language of ambition, resentment, and desire. She studied men as if they were books, each with weaknesses to be marked, each with passages worth memorizing. She listened more than she spoke, storing confidences, cataloguing grudges, watching as Russia's great families tore at each other with pride and paranoia. This was Catherine's true enlightenment. Not the abstract ideals copied from Parisian manuscripts, but the living, breathing practice of turning knowledge into leverage. For her, reason was not a candle in the dark, it was a scalpel precise and merciless, and she would wield it not in salons but in the barracks, the chancelleries, the guarded chambers of St. Petersburg. By the time her husband mounted the throne, she already knew his reign would be short. Not because of prophecy or fate, but because she had mapped the battlefield with an attention he never bothered to imagine. Peter saw Russia as a stage for his Prussian fantasies. Catherine saw it as a chessboard, and she had already studied the pieces. The irony is almost cruel. In the very years Peter dismissed her as a foreign wife unworthy of notice, Catherine was shaping herself into something more dangerous than any rival noble or woman who had mastered the double language of her age, the rhetoric of enlightenment and the theatre of Russian autocracy. When the moment came, she would speak to soldiers in their own tongue, to nobles in theirs, to priests in the voice of faith, and to Europe in the cadence of philosophy. And in every case she would sound exactly like the ruler they had been waiting for. If Catherine's books taught her how to think like a ruler, it was the guards who would decide whether she could become one. Russia's emperors had long learned a bitter truth. The throne in St. Petersburg rested less on divine right than on the bayonets of the Imperial Guard. They were elite soldiers, battle-tested in the 7 Years' War, proud of their sacrifices, and deeply sensitive to slights from rulers who failed to honour them. Their loyalty could elevate a sovereign or extinguish him overnight. This is where Grigory Orlov enters the stage, standing nearly 2 meters tall, broad-shouldered, with the icy eyes of a man born to command. Orlov was more than a soldier. He was the kind of figure legends attach themselves to. Among the wives of the nobility he was whispered about with both admiration and fear. Among the rank and file he was adored for his straightforward courage. Among his fellow officers he embodied what Peter lacked honour. The first contact came not in some clandestine alley, but at a court ball in 1762. Imagine the ballroom chandeliers, glittering silk gowns sweeping across polished floors, the orchestra rising above the murmur of politics half hidden in laughter. Peter, drunk and distracted, sat in a corner with his toy soldiers, his mistress clumsily trying to play the part of an empress. And then Catherine, wrapped in imperial blue, crossed the floor toward Orlov. Her opening words were deceptively simple, "Commander. I have heard you are the only man here who still understands what honour means." It was not merely flattery. It was a calculated blow at Peter at the decay of military tradition and at the same time a pledge that Catherine valued what Orlov lived for. In that moment she gave him something his emperor never had: respect. The psychology that followed was not a whirlwind affair but a masterclass in patience. Catherine did not fling herself into his arms. She sought his counsel, asked about troop morale, voiced concern for Russia's standing after Peter's humiliating treaty with Prussia. Each conversation positioned her not as a lover, but as a patriot in need of an ally. By the time intimacy followed, Orlov did not believe he was betraying his sovereign. He believed he was saving his country. To grasp the depth of this maneuver, consider the Guards' mood after the 7 Years' War. They had bled for victories and days in Central Europe only to be told by Peter that their sacrifices meant nothing, that Russia's gains would be surrendered in favour of Frederick the Great, Peter's idol. Soldiers who had buried brothers in foreign fields now watched their Tsar toast their enemy. Rage smouldered in the barracks, and Catherine fanned it carefully, never too quickly, never too openly, but always with the assurance that she listened when Peter mocked them. Orlov was more than a lover. He was the gateway to steel. His brothers held commands across key regiments. His word carried the weight of entire battalions. By binding him to her, Catherine was binding the Guards themselves. And in Russia, that was equivalent to binding destiny. What makes this moment extraordinary is not just the romance or even the conspiracy. It is the way Catherine inverted gender expectations in the most dangerous arena of her world. She made Orlov believe he was the knight rescuing a wronged woman, when in truth she was the general enlisting a soldier. He thought he was conquering her. In reality, she was conquering the only army that mattered. From that night forward, every step Catherine took was reinforced by the silent march of boots in the background. The Guards had begun to shift their loyalty not from one monarch to another, but from a hollow Tsar to a woman who embodied the honour he had squandered. And when the time came to act, it would be their strength channeled through Orlov that transformed Catherine's humiliation into a throne. If Grigory Orlov gave Catherine muscle, Stanisław Poniatowski offered her vision eyes and ears beyond Russia's borders and a mirror in which she could test the image of the ruler she wished to become. Their relationship did not ignite in a ballroom or on a battlefield, but in the quieter sanctum of the Imperial Library. Picture the scene. Candlelight flickering across shelves stacked with French treatises and Latin chronicles, dust motes spinning lazily in the air as winter frost crept at the window panes. Catherine would arrive at precisely the hour she knew Poniatowski liked to read, always by chance. Their conversations began with Montesquieu, drifted into Voltaire, and soon wove seamlessly into questions of Russian reform. Unlike Orlov, who needed to feel like a defender of honour, Poniatowski required a different seduction. Intellectual recognition. Catherine gave him that and more. She spoke as his equal, sometimes his challenger, inviting him into a dialogue where her wit shone as brightly as her beauty. To him she was not the neglected consort of an erratic Tsar. She was an Enlightenment monarch in embryo, a sovereign in waiting who carried the future of Russia in her mind. But Catherine was never merely flirting. She was opening a channel. Through Poniatowski's diplomatic connections, whispers of Catherine the Reformer began to drift across Europe. In Parisian salons she was painted as a potential Voltairian heroine. In Vienna, cautious reports noted her intelligence and restraint. In London, dispatches speculated that if she ever ruled, she might prove more stable than her husband. These were not idle rumours. They were insurance policies. If Catherine seized power, Europe would already have a narrative ready, not a usurper's wife hungry for vengeance, but a woman enlightened enough to rescue Russia from chaos. To appreciate the brilliance here, consider how Europe consumed information in the 18th century. Armies could conquer territory, but reputations conquered legitimacy. Salons in Paris shaped as much politics as parliaments. Coffee houses in London buzzed with news sheets that could elevate or damn rulers half a continent away. Poniatowski became Catherine's courier into that world. By sharing her thoughts with him, her vision of legal reform, her admiration for Montesquieu's checks on power, she ensured those words would not stay confined to the Imperial Library. They would echo in Vienna chancelleries, in London's clubs, in Parisian drawing rooms. This was soft power before the phrase existed. Where Orlov secured bayonets, Poniatowski secured ideas. Catherine understood that when the coup came, she would need not only soldiers in St. Petersburg, but sympathetic whispers abroad. If she appeared to Europe as a reformer rather than a usurper, her gamble would look less like treason and more like destiny. The contrast with Peter could not have been sharper. While he played with lead soldiers and paraded in Prussian uniforms, his wife held conversations that ranged from the role of law in shaping nations to the potential of Russia as a modern European state. Catherine was rehearsing not just for power, but for legitimacy, the difference between a coup that ends in blood and a coup that endures in history. And so in those evenings, among books and arguments, Catherine did more than charm a Polish noble. She drafted the outlines of her reign's public image. To Orlov, she had been the patriot in need of a sword. To Poniatowski, she was the philosopher. Queen Russia deserved. Both roles were masks, but behind them Catherine was building the scaffolding of empire, one regiment, one salon, one conversation at a time. By the winter of 1762, Catherine's web already held steel and whispers. What she still lacked was the one thing every coup requires to endure a paper shield. Armies can depose a ruler, but only legality, or the appearance of it, can keep the world from calling it naked treason. For this Catherine turned not to a young lover, but to an old man nearly twice her age, Chancellor Alexei Bestuchev-Ryumin. Bestuchev was 68, stooped and sour yet encyclopedic in his knowledge of Russian politics. For decades he had steered the empire's foreign affairs, signing treaties, weaving alliances, and critically keeping secret files on nearly every noble family in the land. He had been humiliated earlier that year when Peter dismissed him precisely because he opposed the Tsar's disastrous pivot toward Prussia. Stripped of office, forced into retirement, he simmered in bitterness. And that bitterness was precisely what Catherine needed. She approached him not with seduction, but with reverence. Where Orlov required honour, and Poniatowski flattery of intellect, Bestuchev required something else entirely, the balm of being valued again. Catherine visited his residence under the pretext of learning from his wisdom. She praised his long service to Russia, called his dismissal a tragedy for the empire, and asked his counsel on matters small enough to seem harmless: minor disputes, diplomatic etiquette, the history of treaties. Session by session, she coaxed him back into the role he craved, mentor, not relic. In those long conversations, Catherine planted a seed. What if she asked gently an emperor ever proved incapable of serving the state, not wicked, not treasonous, merely incompetent? Did Russia's laws allow for protection of the empire in such a case? Here the expansion becomes clear. Russia's legal culture in the 18th century was patchwork at best. The throne was sacralized, but precedent for regency existed, especially for child emperors or incapacitated sovereigns. The idea that the Empress could serve as regent in times of weakness was not outrageous. It simply needed articulation. Bestuchev, with his mastery of imperial precedents, was the perfect scribe. And so Catherine steered him towards drafting a document, not a coup order, but a contingency. It would state that in moments of imperial incompetence, if a Tsar endangered the church, betrayed the army, or bankrupted the state, the Empress might assume temporary guardianship for the good of Russia. Nothing in it mentioned Peter. Nothing in it screamed rebellion. On paper, it was patriotism. In practice, it was Catherine's insurance policy, a pre-written justification ready to be unsheathed the day Peter's reign collapsed under its own absurdities. This was Catherine's genius to prepare the battlefield, not only with muskets and allies, but with parchment and precedent. Orlov could seize the palace, but without Bestuchev's words it would look like usurpation. With them it would look like rescue. Europe might protest, but they would have a legal fig leaf to soothe their consciences. Russia's nobility might hesitate, but they could claim they were acting within the law. In short, Catherine understood that in the empire of symbols paper could be as sharp as steel. And by binding Bestuchev to her not with passion but with restored dignity, she turned a discarded statesman into the architect of plausible legality. When the coup came and Orlov's guards marched into Peter's chambers, they would carry not only muskets but also documents, and documents Catherine knew could transform treason into destiny. If this moment made you smile, drop a number 1 in the comments so I know you're still here with me. Catherine already had the guards in her corner through Orlov. She had a voice in Europe through Poniatowski. She had legality half prepared through Bestuchev. But even with such pieces aligned, she did not rush. To move too soon was to risk being branded a schemer, a faithless wife, a foreign usurper. What she needed was a trigger not one of her own making, but an error so colossal, so undeniable, that Peter himself would load the musket for her. And Peter, true to form, obliged. His obsession was Holstein, a petty German duchy he had inherited but never truly ruled. To Peter it was more than land, it was a toy kingdom, a stage where he might finally play the Frederick the Great he so desperately imitated. So scarcely months after Russia had bled itself dry in the 7 Years' War, he announced his intention to drag the empire into another conflict, this time against Denmark, in order to reclaim Holstein's scraps of territory. It was madness. The treasury lay hollow, drained by years of campaigns. Soldiers longed to return home, not march to another war in the swamps of Schleswig. Nobles groaned under the weight of new levies. The country needed peace and healing. Peter offered them another exhausting adventure for a vanity prize. But worse was yet to come. To finance this war, Peter ordered the confiscation of properties belonging to the Orthodox Church. Centuries of reverence and privilege were cast aside in one decree. Monasteries that had stood as anchors of Russian identity found their lands seized their revenues, redirected to fund a Holstein dream no one shared. In a single stroke, Peter managed to insult the Church's authority, drain its wealth, and threaten its spiritual standing among the faithful. Inside the Holy Synod, the governing council of the Church shock gave way to fury. Bishops who had long tolerated Peter's eccentricities whispered of sacrilege. For the clergy, this was not merely a financial inconvenience. It was a violation of holy trust, a ruler putting secular obsession above sacred duty. Catherine, careful not to be seen as conspirator, positioned herself as a quiet listener, offering sympathy in private conversations. Every complaint, every grumble of discontent she absorbed and stored like tinder waiting for a spark. Meanwhile, in the officer corps, outrage seethed. Soldiers who had buried comrades in Prussia were now told they would march again this time, not even for honour, but for their emperor's childish grudge. The guards already loyal to Orlov grew openly disdainful of Peter's commands. Even veteran generals muttered of betrayal. To alienate one pillar of power, the nobility, the army, or the church might have been survivable. To alienate all three at once was suicide, and Peter, oblivious in his Prussian boots, had managed just that. Catherine understood the moment. She did not need to invent treason. Peter was committing it against himself. Each decree he signed, each slight he inflicted, only tightened the noose he had woven around his own neck. And so Catherine waited patient as a hunter, poised as if at the edge of a chessboard, watching for the exact move that would collapse her husband's position. When it came, she would not need to justify her actions. Russia itself, officers, nobles, clergy would cry out for deliverance. It was no longer a question of if, it was only a matter of when. The night before the storm broke, the Winter Palace did not sleep. In one chamber, Peter drank himself senseless beside Vorontsova, convinced that his authority was untouchable. In another, Catherine spread maps across her bed, silk sheets transformed into a general's table. Grigory Orlov stood at her side, leaning over candle-lit charts of the palace grounds and barracks, the two of them whispering not as lovers, but as co-commanders of a coup. The plan was daring in its simplicity. At dawn, Orlov would mobilize the guards. They would enter Peter's quarters under the pretense of routine duty, then place him under arrest for treason against the empire. Yet the brilliance lay not only in the maneuver, but in the framing. This would not be a wife overthrowing her husband. It would be soldiers intervening to save Russia from a sovereign who had betrayed its faith, its nobility, and its exhausted armies. Catherine's genius was theatrical as much as strategic. She understood that power in Russia could not be seized with steel alone. It had to be clothed in the language of necessity, even sanctity. And so she staged her role with exquisite care. At the very hour Orlov marched with his guards, Catherine would be seen kneeling in a cathedral, praying for wisdom, tears glistening, as if reluctant to accept the crown. The narrative would be clear: she had not sought power, it had been thrust upon her by patriots and by Providence. This dramaturgy mattered more than modern readers might imagine. Russia has always loved its rulers less for romance than for inevitability. The people could forgive cruelty, even bloodshed, if convinced that the sovereign's rise was ordained unavoidable, an act demanded by history itself. Catherine choreographed her coup like a liturgy, soldiers in the palace, nobles arriving to beg her to take command, the clergy blessing her in the name of salvation. Each act performed in sequence, each scene reinforcing the illusion that the empire itself had spoken. And in truth it had. The army despised Peter, the nobility scorned him, the clergy cursed him. Catherine did not invent their hatred. She merely gathered it, shaped it, and returned it to them as a story they were ready to believe. On that night, with maps creased by her hand and shadows flickering across her face, Catherine was no longer the humiliated consort. She was the director of a drama centuries in the making, the woman who would step onto the stage at dawn not as conspirator, but as reluctant saviour. When thrones wobble, Russia does not ask for declarations of love. It asks for necessity for a ruler who seems chosen by fate when all other choices collapse. Catherine was ready to provide exactly that. At dawn, the choreography unfolded exactly as Catherine had planned. Orlov and his pair stormed Peter's chambers, his boots clattering against polished floors, sabres gleaming. The Tsar, still half drunk, mistook the intrusion for a drill. Only when iron cuffs closed around his wrists did he realize the game was over. In less than an hour, the Emperor of all the Russias was reduced to a prisoner, bewildered and humiliated. In the very palace he believed impregnable. Yet in a coup, the arrest is only half the battle. The greater war is for narrative. Catherine knew this instinctively. Thrones are not secured with iron alone, but with stories people choose to repeat. And so while Peter was dragged away, Catherine appeared not as a conspirator, but as a supplicant kneeling in the cathedral of Kazan. Nobles and guards approached her, with rehearsed urgency, begging her to assume the burden of power for the salvation of Russia. She protested, hesitated, then reluctantly, as if compelled by duty, accepted. It was theatre, but theatre performed with the precision of liturgy. Within hours, proclamations were drafted and distributed. The language was not of rebellion, but of rescue. Russia had been endangered by Peter's incompetence, and Catherine, compelled by the will of the people and the grace of God, had stepped forward to preserve the empire. She did not speak of vengeance. She spoke of stability, of continuity, of love for her adopted homeland. And what of Peter officially? He abdicated voluntarily. He signed away his throne, declaring Catherine the rightful sovereign. Days later, news spread that he had died of colic, a vague, almost comic affliction for a man so recently crowned. Few believed it, but belief was irrelevant. The important thing was that no official bulletin ever admitted murder. Rumours swirled in taverns and embassies of strangulation, of poison, of guards, silencing him forever. Catherine allowed whispers to circulate it, but never confirmed them. Ambiguity, after all, was safer than confession. Managing the aftermath required delicate timing. Bulletins were released not in a rush, but in a drip of carefully measured updates: the abdication, the Empress's sorrowful acceptance, the unfortunate but natural death of the former Tsar. Each notice softened the shock, each phrasing cast Catherine as both widow and saviour. Beyond Russia, Europe reacted with wary fascination. In London, dispatches framed her as a bold reformer. In Paris, salons buzzed with gossip of a woman who had outmanoeuvred her husband with elegance and nerve. In Vienna, the tone was more cautious, anxious about precedent, uneasy at the thought that a throne could be overturned in a single night. Was it a coup? Was it a correction? The ambiguity suited Catherine perfectly. Inside Russia, the palace whispered its own interpretations. Some called it treachery, others called it justice. But the one phrase that began to circulate even among skeptics was necessity. Peter had alienated the church, betrayed the army, insulted the nobility. His fall was not scandal, but inevitability, and inevitability is the strongest shield a ruler can wear. So Catherine's first days as Empress were not secured by bayonets alone. They were secured by the story she wrapped around the bayonets, the tale of a woman who had been compelled against her own desire to save Russia. And once people began to repeat that tale, it mattered little whether they believed it. Repetition alone was enough to make it true. Catherine understood what many usurpers forget: seizing power is swift, but keeping it is a lifetime's work. The coup had been the violent spark. Now came the long, slow burn of consolidation. And in this, Catherine proved herself as cunning after the throne as before it. Her first insight was simple yet radical: soldiers can give you a crown, but only people can make it endure. The guards had marched her into power, but guards could just as easily march her out again. What she required was a second army, not of steel, but of loyalty. Personal loyalty woven through favours, titles, and carefully cultivated affection would be her shield. This was where Catherine turned her supposed weakness. Her gender turned her into her strongest weapon. In a court still soaked in masculine hierarchy, she leaned into the role of patroness rather than rival. Men might scoff at the thought of a woman wielding power directly, but they were eager to become her protectors, her confidants, her indispensable advisors. Catherine encouraged the illusion even as she orchestrated it. To each man she offered a role in her story. In return, they gave her a loyalty that decrees alone could never secure. She wove a net of patronage that extended from palace to provinces. Old noble houses who worried about her German blood were soothed with marriages, estates, and public gestures of respect. Ambitious young officers were promoted, their careers rising in tandem with her favour. Even dismissed lovers were cushioned with titles and lands transformed from potential enemies into grateful clients. Where Peter had humiliated and discarded Catherine rewarded and retained. This network was more durable than law itself. A decree can be revoked, a statute ignored. But a man who has been elevated, whose family fortune now rests on the Empress's smile, has no incentive to rebel. Catherine understood that fear yields obedience, but gratitude yields permanence. And permanence was the currency she needed to survive in a court that had already overthrown too many rulers. The brilliance of this system lay in its flexibility. To the military she appeared as a commander-in-chief who valued their sacrifices. To the clergy she posed as a daughter of orthodoxy, humble before their blessing. To intellectuals she played the philosopher queen, quoting Voltaire and hinting at reforms. To foreign diplomats she was the stabilizing force who had saved Russia from her husband's folly. Each mask fit the audience, yet behind them all stood the same iron will. Catherine knew she was walking a razor's edge. A woman on the throne could be dismissed as an accident, tolerated only until the next strongman emerged, but she reframed her femininity as advantage. Where men ruled by command, she ruled by persuasion. Where they inspired fear, she inspired devotion. It was in its way a softer form of tyranny, one that left courtiers flattered, rather than frightened, yet bound all the same. And so in the months after Peter's death, Catherine laid the foundation of a reign that would last not weeks or months, but decades. She had proven that taking power was the easy part. The true genius was to build a web so strong that no sword could cut it. A web spun not of law or armies alone, but of human bonds, personal, emotional, unbreakable. Catherine's genius was not simply in choosing favourites, but in converting them into something far rarer functionaries, each assigned a role in her broader design. Lovers and confidants were not indulged as ornaments. They were portfolios carefully selected to perform political functions at precise moments. Where another monarch might choose companions by whim, Catherine chose hers as if drafting ministers. Take Sergei Saltykov, for instance. His family ties reassured the old guard of Russian nobility that Catherine respected their traditions. His very presence at her side was a signal to ancient boyar clans that she was no foreign usurper, but a sovereign who acknowledged their heritage. Then came the reformist jurists, men who whispered in her chambers about law codes and justice-shaping drafts that would one day become the nakaz. Catherine's bedchamber, in other words, doubled as a workshop of governance. Military talent, too, was never far. Grigory Potemkin, visionary strategist and eventual architect of southern expansion, was as indispensable in the council as he was in her private life. Each man gave her something she required at that precise stage of rule, legitimacy, reform, or conquest. But perhaps Catherine's most subtle brilliance lay not in how she acquired favourites, but in how she released them. In the lethal atmosphere of St. Petersburg, a discarded lover could too easily become a bitter conspirator. Catherine refused to make enemies of her past. Instead, she perfected the art of dignified dismissal. When a man's usefulness had waned, he was not humiliated. He was elevated, granted titles, estates, or diplomatic postings that kept him both honoured and out of mischief. This gift economy was not mere generosity, it was counter-coup insurance. By ensuring no former favourite felt discarded, she prevented the formation of resentful factions. A noble ex-lover with a new estate in the provinces had little incentive to plot against her. Indeed, many became defenders of her reign, bound not by fear but by gratitude. The system rippled outward. Courtiers learned that loyalty was rewarded handsomely, and even those who never warmed her bed benefited from the precedent. Catherine's rule was not merely autocracy, it was patronage refined into science. She made her court believe that to serve her was to prosper, and that even departure brought honour rather than disgrace. This was a stark contrast to Peter's clumsy cruelties, his habit of humiliating nobles, or casting aside allies. Where he bred enemies, Catherine bred clients. Where he mocked loyalty, she institutionalized it. The result was a circle of men who, long after their intimacy had ended, remained her allies, grateful, wealthy, and indebted to the hand that had raised them. In a state where coups were as common as coronations, Catherine's strategy was revolutionary. She did not merely build a harem of lovers, she built a cabinet of functionaries, each one a stone in the fortress of her reign, and when they were replaced they left not as exiles but as monuments to her generosity. Monuments that ironically made the throne she seized appear less fragile and more inevitable. Among all Catherine's chosen men, one name towers above the rest, Grigory Potemkin. He was not merely a lover or court favourite, he was her partner in building empire. Where others had given Catherine Anne survival legitimacy or legal cover, Potemkin offered her something greater vision. He saw what Russia could be beyond the forests of the north and the courts of St. Petersburg. His gaze fixed on the Black Sea, that ancient highway of trade and conquest still dominated by the Ottoman Empire. For Potemkin, Russia's destiny lay in turning south and carving out a warm-water empire that could rival the great maritime powers of Europe. And Catherine, ever the strategist, recognized the brilliance in his ambition. Together, they pursued expansion not just with armies, but with settlements. Potemkin was a master of founding cities, Kherson, Sevastopol, Ekaterinoslav names that would one day echo with the weight of Russia's southern frontier. To him, a city was not merely a cluster of buildings, but a declaration of permanence. Where Peter had obsessed over toy soldiers, Potemkin sketched ports, shipyards, and fortresses that would anchor Russia to the Black Sea forever. But Potemkin was not only a builder of cities, he was also a master of theatre. The most famous example came in 1787 when Catherine herself sailed down the Dnieper River to inspect her newly conquered southern provinces. Potemkin orchestrated the journey like a stage play. A flotilla of gilded barges carried the Empress in luxury, accompanied by musicians, courtiers, and foreign ambassadors. Along the riverbanks, villages appeared to spring up overnight, freshly painted houses, cheering crowds, livestock driven in for the spectacle. Were these Potemkin villages elaborate fakes meant to deceive Catherine into believing the land more prosperous than it was? Historians argue still. But whether myth or embellishment, the truth is more subtle. Potemkin was not trying to fool Catherine. She knew too much to be deceived, but to impress the watching ambassadors. The spectacle was less about crops and cottages, more about optics, a message to Europe that Russia's conquest of the south was not only successful, but flourishing, civilized, unstoppable. It worked. Diplomats carried home reports of Catherine's triumphal journey of thriving towns and loyal subjects of the Empress sailing as if she were mistress of a new Mediterranean. Myth blurred into propaganda, propaganda into perception, and perception into fact. The Ottomans trembled, Austria calculated alliances, and Europe began to accept that Russia was no longer a northern giant, but a southern power as well. Logistics underpinned the theatre. Potemkin's supply lines kept thousands fed, his administrators coordinated the movements of fleets and carriages, his officers drilled troops who marched in carefully staged reviews for Catherine's inspection. To the outside world it looked effortless. To those inside it was a feat of organisation as impressive as any battle. The partnership between Catherine and Potemkin was symbiotic. She gave him legitimacy, the crown that could authorise his vision. He gave her expansion, the map of empire redrawn in her favour. Their intimacy waxed and waned, but their political union never faltered. Even after their romance cooled, Catherine trusted Potemkin more than any other man to secure her southern frontier. In him, Catherine found what she had sought all along, not merely a lover, but a co-architect of destiny. Together they turned humiliation into hegemony, and sketches on parchment into cities of stone, and in the process they reshaped the map of Europe. Conquest is often imagined in smoke and cannon fire, but Catherine and Potemkin demonstrated that empire could also be taken with pageantry and persuasion. Nowhere was this clearer than in Crimea. By the early 1780s, the peninsula was a glittering prize commanding the Black Sea. Rich in harbours, a crossroads of trade and migration. Nominally, it remained under the protection of the Ottoman Empire, but the Tatars who ruled locally were divided, weary of constant Ottoman oversight and vulnerable to bribery and intimidation. Potemkin knew that storming Crimea outright would mean another costly war. Catherine wanted results without attrition, and so they devised a different strategy: annexation without invasion. The plan was simple in concept, audacious in execution. If Crimea could be dazzled into believing that union with Russia meant prestige, wealth, and permanence, then the act of submission would appear voluntary. And if Europe could be convinced that local leaders offered loyalty freely, then the annexation would look less like conquest and more like consent. So Catherine staged magnificence as intimidation. Her journey south in 1787 was a pageant for the ages, golden barges drifting down the Dnieper, fireworks exploding over new fortresses, feasts where Tatar nobles sat alongside Russian generals, villages, freshly painted crowds arranged to cheer, livestock herded in for abundance. It was spectacle designed to overwhelm. To locals the message was clear: this was not a ruler begging their allegiance, but an empress whose power had already transformed the land. Resistance would be folly, joining her would be honour. Yet Catherine's audience was not only the Tatars. Foreign ambassadors trailed in her wake, recording every salute, every festival, every tableau of prosperity. Their dispatches spread across Europe, laundering the annexation into legitimacy. Reports describe Crimea not as a territory bullied into subjugation, but as a province eager to embrace civilization under Catherine's enlightened rule. The Ottomans might fume, but Paris, Vienna and London read of inevitability, not outrage. Behind the theatre, of course, lay the hard work of politics. Potemkin bribed Tatar elites, promised safety to wavering leaders, and quietly positioned troops where persuasion might fail. The Khans, riven by rivalries, found themselves flattered, feasted, and finally outmaneuvered. By 1783, Crimea was formally annexed. No grand battle marked the occasion. No rivers of blood, only documents, processions, and a sense that resistance had already been rendered obsolete. The Ottomans, humiliated, could only gnash their teeth. Their empire, once feared, looked suddenly fragile. Europe, wary of Catherine, but impressed by her finesse, grudgingly accepted the new border. And Russia, triumphant, gained not just land, but myth that Catherine could conquer without unsheathing the sword. This was the essence of her mastery. She understood that in the 18th century, legitimacy was not only about possession, but about performance. Crimea was annexed not just on the ground, but in the minds of Europe's chancelleries where perception shaped reality. It was conquest by magnificence, a new kind of empire building, where cities' spectacles and carefully curated audiences did what armies could not. And it confirmed Catherine's place not just as a ruler of Russia, but as a strategist who reshaped how power itself could be exercised. Every empire is written in ledgers as much as in blood. Catherine grasped this earlier than most. She had learned from Peter's downfall that armies cannot march without coin, and reform collapses when the treasury runs dry. Muskets, fortresses, fleets, all the theatre of power depend first upon arithmetic. Russia in the mid-18th century lagged woefully behind its rivals. Britain financed global wars with bonds and a sophisticated credit system. France, despite its looming bankruptcy, ran a bustling financial bureaucracy capable of moving loans across continents. Russia, by contrast, clung to medieval habits. Land taxes farmed inefficiently, revenues pilfered by local elites, and a reliance on forced levies that bred resentment without producing stability. Catherine resolved to modernize, and she did so in a characteristically personal way. Finance became her private curriculum. Just as she had once taught herself, Russian and Montesquieu, now she sat with men who understood banking and credit, absorbing lessons in paper money, international loans, and the mechanics of fiscal reform. One lover, Ivan Rimsky-Korsakov, was less useful as a politician than as a tutor in modern finance. In the privacy of her chambers, he explained concepts that would never appear in official instruction: how to float state bonds, how to stabilize currency, how credit could multiply resources without emptying treasuries. What Catherine grasped was that financial literacy was itself a weapon. Where her predecessors saw coin as static, she saw it as fluid, a force to be harnessed and multiplied. By the 1780s, she had overseen the creation of Russia's first state bank, introduced paper assignats, and doubled revenues without doubling oppression. Wars that would once have bankrupted the empire were now waged on credit. Reforms that might have died for lack of funds were sustained by a steady flow of cash. The transformation was quiet but revolutionary. Soldiers noticed that their pay arrived more regularly, merchants that contracts were honoured, foreign lenders that Russia could be trusted to meet obligations. These are not the details that set hearts racing, but they are the sinews that bind empires. With coin came confidence. With confidence came legitimacy. This too was a contrast with Peter. He had squandered resources on Holstein fantasies and alienated the church in a desperate hunt for funds. Catherine, by contrast, created a system where revenue could flow without constant crisis. Where Peter demanded sacrifice, Catherine promised stability. And in a land exhausted by upheaval, stability was as intoxicating as glory. In the end, Catherine's fiscal reforms were not as flamboyant as her conquests, but they were perhaps more enduring. Muskets rust and fortresses crumble, but a functioning financial system sustains power across generations. Catherine had built not just an army of soldiers, but an invisible army of coins, notes, and credit lines. And that army, silent though it was, may have been her most loyal of all. For all her brilliance, Catherine was not immune to the solitude of power. An empress sits surrounded by courtiers, armies, and flatterers, yet at the summit she is alone, every gesture scrutinized, every word interpreted, every affection suspect. Even her lovers, so often instruments of policy, could blur into roles rather than relationships. It was a kind of loneliness more suffocating than exile, and Catherine, for all her clarity, sometimes needed relief. That relief came in the unlikely form of Alexander Lanskoy. Barely 23 when he entered her life, he was no Potemkin, no Orlov, no architect of empire. He had little political weight, no vast family network, no strategic portfolio to offer. What he gave Catherine was something altogether different: sincerity. He adored her not as an empress to be flattered, but as a woman to be cherished. And for a time, Catherine allowed herself the luxury of that illusion. To outsiders, the match was puzzling, even scandalous. Why would the Empress at 51 devote herself to a man half her age with no clear utility? The answer lies not in politics, but in psychology. Lanskoy's presence gave Catherine an emotional ballast she had long denied herself. In his company, she could set aside the mask of strategist and simply exist. The laughter they shared, the intimacy, unburdened by a calculation, softened her reign in subtle but measurable ways. During the 4 years of their relationship, Catherine's policies reflected a rare tenderness. She issued decrees aimed at reducing corporal punishment, expanded educational initiatives, and spoke with new warmth in correspondence. Grief, when it eventually came, confirmed how much he had mattered. In 1784, Lanskoy died suddenly of an illness. Catherine wept openly, composed mournful letters, and retreated into silence. The Empress who had steered armies and annexed kingdoms was for a brief moment simply a woman devastated by loss. Yet grief did not unmake her. If anything, it clarified her boundaries. Catherine returned to her throne with renewed coldness, as if reminding herself that indulgence had its price. The loneliness of sovereign power, she concluded, could never truly be cured, only managed. And so she returned to her older pattern, choosing men not for affection, but for function, ensuring that sentiment would never again intrude too deeply into the machinery of rule. The episode reveals the paradox of Catherine's reign. Her humanity enriched her governance when contained softening decrees and widening reforms. But she knew she could not allow that humanity to rule her. To govern millions, she had to remain inhumanly clear-eyed, always ready to see allies as pieces lovers, as instruments, courtiers as extensions of policy. The sovereign's solitude demanded it. Alexander Lansky then was less a footnote than a lesson, a reminder that even the most powerful rulers sometimes require companionship, not for strategy but for survival. Catherine absorbed that lesson, grieved it, and returned to her throne sharper than before. It was a glimpse of the human cost behind the mask of inevitability, the price she paid for the clarity that defined her reign. Catherine's mastery did not go unnoticed. Across Europe, chancelleries began to whisper a dangerous thought: if she could build power with lovers, perhaps she could also be undone by them. What if the same weapon she wielded so effectively could be turned against her? And so quietly foreign courts experimented with seduction as sabotage dispatching, polished young men schooled in charm and intrigue to win the Empress's confidence and bend her policies from within. It was a risky game. To Western rulers who imagined Catherine as a woman ruled by desire, the plan seemed plausible. But they underestimated the years she had spent perfecting the art of separating sentiment from strategy. For Catherine, intimacy was never surrender, it was surveillance. A would-be seducer might enter her chambers thinking he was on a mission. He often left as an asset converted into her service by flattery rewards or the sheer force of her presence. One of the most colourful stories involves Count Alessandro Cagliostro, the Italian adventurer rumoured to have been sent by the Vatican itself. Accounts describe him as a master of persuasion armed with alchemy, mysticism, and the reputation of irresistible charm. Yet within months, Catherine supposedly had him reading from his own dispatches letters meant for Rome, now copied onto her desk. Legend has it that she smiled across the table and suggested almost sweetly that he continue sending reports, but reports she would dictate. Whether true or embellished, the story encapsulates her reputation, a woman impossible to outmaneuver. The boudoir, because she never forgot that the boudoir was simply another battlefield. Here we must pause to distinguish legend from archive. Did Catherine truly toy with papal spies over candlelight dinners? The records are murky. Her details likely grew in the telling, embroidered by courtiers eager to enhance her mystique. But even if half of it is apocryphal, the fact that such stories circulated tells us something crucial. Catherine had become the empress of reputation, as well as empire. Her enemies painted her as dangerously seductive, not because the details mattered, but because the image itself carried weight. This reputation economy worked to her advantage. The more Europe feared her charm, the less likely they were to trust their own envoys around her. Diplomats approached her court already on guard, already suspecting they might be compromised, already conceding that she held the stronger hand. Catherine didn't have to prove the legend true. She only had to let it breathe, and so the tactic meant to weaken her instead reinforced her myth. Each would-be seducer who entered her orbit was another opportunity to demonstrate her supremacy, not just on the battlefield or in diplomacy, but in the intimate theatre, where psychology outweighed steel. Catherine had inverted the strategy foreign courts thought they were sending hunters, but she turned them into prey. This more than anything revealed the depth of her game. She was not merely the victim of gossip, nor merely the manipulator of men. She was both, and she used the tension between legend and reality as another tool of rule. In the end, it mattered less whether the Vatican's agent truly fell to his knees, or whether the Austrian envoy truly betrayed his master. What mattered was that everyone believed Catherine was capable of such feats, and in politics, belief is often as powerful as fact. By the time Catherine reached her 60s, she no longer needed to prove her right to rule with coups or theatre. Her power was secure, her enemies subdued, her borders expanded. Now she set about something far more ambitious, turning her empire itself into a kind of classroom, where Enlightenment ideals could be tested on Russian soil, reshaped, adapted, sometimes betrayed, but always proclaimed as evidence of her vision. The most famous artifact of this experiment was the nakaz, or instruction, issued in 1767. On its surface, it was a manifesto of Enlightenment thinking. Drawing from Montesquieu, Beccaria and Voltaire, Catherine declared that laws must serve the people, that torture was barbaric, that a state existed to safeguard its subjects rather than oppress them. It was rhetoric designed to dazzle Europe, and it succeeded. Philosophers praised her as the Semiramis of the North, a monarch who spoke their language fluently. Yet behind the rhetoric lay contradictions as sharp as ice. The nakaz spoke of liberty, while serfdom deepened, binding millions more tightly to landowners. Catherine knew that dismantling serfdom would alienate the very nobility she relied upon to secure her throne, so she allowed the contradiction to stand: philosophy in print, pragmatism in practice. The empire was her classroom, yes, but one where certain lessons could not be taught without burning down the school. Beyond law codes, Catherine poured energy into education. She founded the Smolny Institute for Noble Maidens, the first state-sponsored school for women in Russia, and established networks of provincial schools for boys. She invited Western architects and artists to St. Petersburg, determined to make her capital rival, Paris or Vienna, as a beacon of culture. The Hermitage, begun as her private gallery, grew into one of the world's great museums, a temple of European art in a land once dismissed as barbaric. Even municipal governance became a field of experimentation. Catherine introduced new charters for towns, granting merchants and local councils a semblance of autonomy. It was not democracy, but it was a recognition that the empire's sprawling provinces required more than decrees from the capital, they required systems. Streets were laid out, sanitation improved, policing formalized. Where once Russia had seemed a patchwork of fiefs and villages, Catherine sought to impose order, even modernity. All of this was philosophy translated into administration Enlightenment ideals, dressed in Russian uniform. To Voltaire, she was the philosopher queen he had dreamed of. To her nobles, she was a sovereign who expanded their privileges while flattering them with talk of progress. To her subjects, she was both distant and dazzling, a woman who promised civilization even as the old inequities endured. The paradox is the essence of Catherine's reign. She understood that ideas were not to be swallowed whole but adapted to circumstance. The nakaz was not a constitution, it was a performance, a signal to Europe that Russia was no longer a backwater, but a participant in the great conversation of modernity. And though serfs remained chained and nobles grew fat, the rhetoric itself mattered. It reshaped how Russia saw itself, and how the world was forced to see Russia. In this sense, Catherine turned her empire into her lifelong project, a laboratory where Enlightenment could be bent into autocracy, and autocracy dressed as Enlightenment. For her, the classroom was never about producing perfection. It was about producing legitimacy, and legitimacy, like any good performance, was always in the eye of the audience. Late in life, Catherine did something astonishing. She took up her pen not to issue decrees or letters to ministers, but to write for posterity. These were not the polished memoirs of a monarch seeking only flattery. They were closer to a manual, a blueprint of power disguised as autobiography. In her pages, Catherine reframed her life as a kind of experiment. Love was not romance, but technology, a tool as sophisticated as coin or cannon. Men had ruled through fear, she observed, but fear yields only obedience, brittle and temporary. Desire, by contrast, binds more deeply. A man convinced he is loved will defend you even against his own interests. And so Catherine admitted, with a clarity bordering on cruelty, that she had built her empire not only on laws and armies, but on the psychology of devotion. Perhaps the coldest passage is the one in which she thanks Peter. His infidelity, she wrote, had been her liberation. Had he been faithful, she might have lived and died as a decorative consort. Instead, his humiliation forced her to see loyalty as something to be earned, never assumed. A crown can be given by marriage, she remarked, but only you can decide if you deserve to wear it. It is gratitude sharpened into irony, the acknowledgement that her husband's betrayal was the catalyst of her greatness. But her writing also reveals the ethical edge of her clarity. Catherine did not delude herself about what she had done. She confessed that after decades of using affection as instrument, she could no longer feel it fully. Love, she said, had become spice tasted so often that the tongue grows numb. Companionship was always provisional, intimacy always provisional. The price of ruling through desire was the erosion of genuine sentiment. Her manuscripts circulated cautiously, copied by hand, whispered through courts, especially among women who grasped their significance. They were not romantic confessions, but coded instructions. Here was a female sovereign laying bare the mechanics of rule, stripping away illusions to reveal politics as artifice. She curated herself as both philosopher queen and ruthless engineer of loyalty, a duality that fascinated and horrified in equal measure. Historians debate how much to take at face value. Some passages are candid, others staged, but whether sincere or performed the effect is the same. Catherine crafted her own myth. She wanted posterity to remember not only the conquests and reforms, but the method. She insisted that her reign was not accident, nor whim, nor feminine caprice. It was discipline, calculation, and above all, clarity. That clarity is what chills us even now. To read her words is to confront a mind that viewed people as instruments, yet acknowledged it without apology. It was not cruelty, she insisted, but necessity. A sovereign cannot afford indulgence. Sentiment clouds judgment. And in Catherine's Russia, where betrayal lurked in every corridor, the refusal to indulge was what kept the crown on her head. Her memoirs, then, are not merely a record of a life. They are a meditation on power's cost, the loneliness it demands, the coldness it rewards, and the inescapable clarity that once attained cannot be unlearned. They are myth and manual confession and performance all at once. When Catherine died in 1796, she left behind not only an empire larger than any her predecessors had commanded, but also a method and operating system of power that could outlive her. The succession itself proved the point. Where earlier coups had thrown Russia into spasms of violence, Catherine's transition unfolded with relative smoothness. Her former favourites, rewarded with estates and titles, had no reason to rebel. Her ministers, tied by decades of patronage, carried her policies forward. The crown passed without the palace erupting in chaos. That was no accident. It was choreography refined over 34 years, designed to prove that her network of loyalties was stronger than any single coup. Her legacy was not just territorial or administrative. It was methodological. She had demonstrated, perhaps more clearly than any ruler before her, that power could be engineered through desire as effectively as through fear. That in a world where women were barred from ruling as men did, a woman might rewrite the rules, entirely reframing her gender, not as liability but as leverage. She had in effect written a manual for navigating patriarchal structures by turning their assumptions inside out, and that manual did not vanish with her. Across Europe, whispers of her strategies found eager students. Napoleon's consort, Josephine Vita Perron, centuries later, women who understood the politics of intimacy as stagecraft, echoed Catherine's techniques. Even in the 21st century, her fingerprints linger in the way reputations are curated, in how leaders construct images of inevitability in the choreography of reluctant power. The Enlightenment salon has given way to the televised press conference, but the mechanics of seduction and legitimacy remain hauntingly familiar. Yet the method carries its shadow. Pageantry makes myths, but records preserve harm. Catherine expanded education, codified laws, and patronized the arts, yet she also deepened serfdom, using millions of peasants as pawns in her game of loyalty with the nobility. She perfected the art of personal devotion, but at the cost of her own capacity for genuine intimacy. She wielded brilliance as weapon, but brilliance untempered by empathy can cut as deeply as any tyrant's cruelty. And so we are left with a question, one that resists simple answers. Was Catherine a heroine, proving that a woman could outthink every man of her age? Was she a sociopath, turning human beings into instruments and leaving a trail of manipulation behind her? Or was she simply the most honest strategist of her century, one who refused to veil the brutal mechanics of power in sentimental illusions? Perhaps the truth is that she was all three, and perhaps that is why her story endures, because it forces us to confront the uncomfortable overlap between genius and ruthlessness, between survival and exploitation, between gender and strategy. Catherine the Great showed that humiliation could be transmuted into empire, that betrayal could become blueprint, that love itself could be reforged as a tool of governance. Her reign, for all its contradictions, remains one of the clearest case studies in how power is not found but made. And so, dear audience, I leave the verdict with you. Was Catherine the Great the wronged wife who became Europe's most brilliant sovereign, or the coldest manipulator her century ever produced? Heroine, sociopath, strategist beyond gender. Which face do you see when you read her legacy? Life lessons from Catherine the Great history rarely offers us neat moral tales. Catherine's story, like so many others, is tangled with brilliance and brutality, clarity and contradiction. And yet when we step back from the particulars, the palace corridors, the lovers turned ministers, the maps spread on silk sheets, certain lessons emerge that echo far beyond 18th century Russia. The first is patience. Catherine teaches us that humiliation can be endured if it is converted into strategy. When Peter paraded his mistress before her, many might have broken. Catherine waited. She listened, learned, mapped her world. Power, she understood, is less about reacting to insult than about choosing the right moment to strike. In any life, whether politics, career, or personal struggle, the lesson holds: timing matters more than fury. The second is adaptability. A German girl arriving in Russia without a word of the language became within years the voice of orthodoxy and the mistress of Russian etiquette. Catherine reminds us that fluency is not only about words, but about people learning their customs, rhythms, weaknesses. In a world where structures are stacked against us, the ability to adapt can transform disadvantage into opportunity. The third is that power rests not on fear alone. Catherine recognized that fear produces obedience, but obedience cracks under pressure. Desire, whether in the form of loyalty, gratitude, or admiration, produces something more enduring. She made her allies feel chosen, her lovers feel indispensable, her nobles feel respected. The lesson is subtle but sharp. People rarely remember commands, but they never forget how you made them feel. A fourth lesson lies in the importance of networks. Catherine never ruled alone. She built webs of guards of nobles, of foreign ambassadors. She turned rivals into clients with land and titles, managed exits with honour so no one became an enemy. We often imagine power as solitary, but she shows us it is sustained by connections carefully tended. In our own time, the equivalent is the quiet work of relationships, alliances, trust that cushions against collapse. The fifth is clarity and its cost. Catherine's gift was to see people as instruments without illusion. That clarity made her reign stable, but it cost her intimacy. Her memoirs confess that after decades of using affection as a tool, she could no longer feel it fully. Here lies the warning: to achieve great clarity may mean surrendering some humanity. Each of us must decide how much we are willing to pay for success, and whether the price is worth it. Finally, Catherine's life shows the double edge of myth. She curated her own legend, understanding that perception can be more powerful than reality. Yet myths also trap fixing her forever as either heroine or villain. The broader lesson: be mindful of the stories we allow to define us, because they may outlive the truth. Catherine's empire has long since passed into history, but the patterns remain: patience, adaptability, persuasion, networks, clarity, myth. They are not only the weapons of sovereigns, they are the tools of survival in every age. Thank you, subscribe now and don't miss what's to come.